Nyleen Kay Marshall was a 4-year-old from Alhambra, Montana. She came from a Mormon family and had 2 siblings. On June 25, 1983, Nylene and her family attended a ham radio operator's picnic in a field in nearby Clancy. Nylene went to play with some other children. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Dentzel, and this is Unfound. Kids say the darndest things. That was a cliche long before the TV show ever started. Why do adults say that? Because children have no filters. They don't yet understand that there are certain ideas and words, and the combinations of such, that are just not to be uttered. In addition, there are statements that a 5-year-old can make and be laughed at, but were a teenager to say the exact same thing, a grounding with no Xbox would be in order. For example, that video from Christmas time 2020 where a child attempts to talk his way out of trouble after writing on himself with a marker. I think the little boy got away with it. If a 15-year-old tried that, probably not so much. But it's not just that. Because children have no preconceptions about how the world works, they once in a while happen upon an obscure connection between ideas and things that adults would never see. Maybe that's why they're so good with Legos. Well, for the disappearance of Nyleen Marshall, she was a child playing with other children at a picnic. Then Nylene was gone. And we're left to figure out if, despite all the adults being involved, that the best clue came from the mouths of babes. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's website, charleyproject.org. Nyleen Marshall was just 4 years old, so it's hard to say what her interests were, other than to guess that they were probably like most other girls her age. However, in those 48 months of her life, Nylene saw her parents get divorced, and her mother marry another man. Fortunately for Nylene and her brother and sister, the new guy adopted all 3 as his own, and everything was perfect in the Marshall family. So, on June 25th, 1983, the entire Marshall family attended a ham radio operator's picnic in Clancy, Montana, just 1 mile away. While the adults did their socializing, the children did theirs, running around in the woods and catching frogs. This included Nylene. Accounts differ, but somehow Nylene got separated from the group of kids, despite her playing amongst them. The adults noticed this fairly quickly and mounted a search effort within minutes. This continued for a few days to no avail. Nylene was never seen again. Law enforcement most importantly followed a lead concerning the description of a man in a jogging suit, who the children said was around them at the time. Police never located this individual. Years later, tragedy would strike again, as someone murdered Nylene's mother in a hotel in Mexico. A case that is also still unsolved. As I stated many times on this program and the live show, we don't cover many child disappearances because in a large majority of these, the parents are the main suspects, and for good reason. Meaning there's no one I can trust who can be interviewed for the program. However, this is not the situation with Nylene's disappearance. So we must try to answer these 3 questions in an attempt to figure out what happened. Number 1, Why are the exact details of how Nylene went missing in that park still vague almost 40 years later? Number 2, can the words of the children be trusted in that they said a man in a jogging suit was playing with Nylene? And number 3, should we take seriously letters sent to Nylene's family 2 years later in which the writer says he kidnapped Nylene? Nylene's father and siblings are open to all possibilities in regards to her disappearance. The guest for this episode, who is back for a third time, is Heather Grotman, creator and writer at lostandfoundblogs.com. Unfound News. If you watch the YouTube live show on Wednesday nights, you know that I've announced a new project. I've gotten together with some of the think tank members, and we will be going back to reinvestigate disappearances that I covered in older episodes, going back to 2016 and 2017. If this pilot project is successful, I will be opening it up to the entire audience. I'll keep you posted. Next, recently I've had some discussions with a TV producer. Yes, I know it's been a while, but he's shown some interest in some of the disappearances we've covered, especially the interview I did with Steve Pankey way back in October of 2019. As I've said before, these things take a long time to develop, if they even happen at all. But if anything transpires, you'll be the first to know. Finally, I'm now at the highest PDGA rating I've ever had for my disc golf career. I'm playing my best disc golf at the age of 50. Believe it. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound supports accounts on Podomatic, iTunes, Spotify, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Deezer, and YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, please join us for the Unfound Live Show. All of you can talk with me, and I can answer your questions. Contribute to Unfound at patreon.com/Unfound Podcast. This week, I need to thank Tammy. You can also contribute at PayPal, paypal.me/Unfound Podcast. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. Merchandise, the books at Amazon.com in both ebook and print form. Do not forget the reviews. Shirts at unfound-podcast.myshopify.com, or you can track down my assistant Heather in the Facebook discussion group. Playing cards at makeplayingcards.com/sell/unfound podcast. The website, theunfoundpodcast.com. And please, mention Unfound at all true crime websites and forums. Thank you. I'm so happy to have again on Unfound the creator and writer at the Lost and Found blogs, Heather Grotman. Heather, welcome to Unfound.
Hello, Ed. It's always a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Well, and I love having you on the program. That's why I was like, man, it's been almost a year since Heather was on when we talked about the disappearance of Christy Nichols. So I thought, yeah, I think it's about time. It's almost been a year, so it's great to have you again. And I know we have a lot of new listeners since a year ago, so let's just talk a little bit about you first. I would never, ask you too many personal details, but you're writing this blog. How long have you been doing it? What motivated you to start it? Why don't we start there?
Well, I believe in May will be the 3-year anniversary of my blog, but it started. I've always loved the television show Unsolved Mysteries, and there's a large message board about the show on Sitcoms Online. And I was a moderator on there for over 10 years, and we would talk about the cases profiled and analyzed, and I would research to see if there were any updates. And I've always enjoyed writing, and it just kind of grew from there. And when I stepped down as moderator, I thought it would be fun and interesting to kind of do deep dives into some of these cases that stick in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And what was the first, I'm going to test you now, see if you remember, what was the first case, whether murder or disappearance, that you covered on your blog? So you say it's coming up on the 3-year anniversary, so I guess 2018. What was the first case that you wrote about?
Oh, it was Joan Risch. I will never forget that case. It's burned in my memory because she just went missing in the middle of the day for no reason. There was blood in the kitchen. She was never found. It just doesn't make any sense. And she's never been found.
And so it's still unsolved?
Yes.
No body found, nothing?
No, and
wow.
I mean, it's one of those cases that nowadays they could test all the blood. And I don't believe it was something that sinister, honestly. I know a lot of people do. I think she was suffering some kind of a hemorrhage. There was someone seen looking, her appearance, brown pants, which I think was dried blood, just kind of wandering. That would make sense why it seemed like a normal day until it didn't. Yeah.
So you decided to write that one as your first one back in 2018. I guess that was one that caught your attention from your unsolved mystery days.
You know what? It wasn't profiled on there, but I had read it, and it just, some of those cases you just never forget. And of course, as I'm writing, I'm researching more, so I'm learning more about the case, which I want to.
Right. Well, maybe if you can remember, and I think this maybe will help anybody who is maybe thinking about starting their own website, their own blog, their own podcast, to hear your insights of how you got started. But what was it about that particular one? I mean, as we know, there's thousands and thousands and thousands. What was it about that one that motivated you to cover that one first?
Actually, I think the biggest reason is they've actually released the police photos of the kitchen. So, I mean, you were literally there at the scene. And I had a friend of mine colorize the blood stain because it was a black and white photo, and it was just chilling. And so definitely the pictures of the kitchen and everything they found really made it stick in my memory.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more in general terms about your blog. How often would you say, what is your rate of publishing? Once a month? Once every 2 months? What would you say the average is? Do you even know? And how many hours do you think you put in per week on your blog?
Well, initially I used to try to do it once a month, but I never wanted to force myself to have a deadline because then I didn't enjoy it. If it was like a job, it was something I wanted to do. So probably every couple of months now. And sometimes I don't spend a lot of time. On the weekends, I'm either trying to figure out the next case or doing research, or then I usually spend like the weekend writing it and the rough draft and going over it. I actually enjoy the research as much as I enjoy the writing. Yeah,
me too. I'm very much like myself, looking into what I do. Of course, as you know, the assistants help me in a variety of ways, but doing interviews for the program and then also doing the blog that I write at Patreon for my Patreon supporters, very much the same thing. I enjoy both. None of it.
Because we're learning more about cases that we're interested in as we're researching.
That's true. We're always learning. That is certainly true. You working on it for almost 3 years, me working on Unfound for about 4.5 years. We're always learning something new. That is certainly true. And the people should know you do this blog, but you have a regular day job.
Yes.
So you have to balance all of that.
Yeah, and that shows that I have a passion for it because I choose to do it in my free time. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I have it in my the outline here. I wanted to ask you. You say you like to write? Do you have any professional writing experience? You talked about being a moderator at the Unsolved Mysteries forums, but do you have any professional writing experience? Writing short stories, books, novels, anything like that? Being that you're now, writing this blog.
No, not really. I mean, I've enjoyed writing since I was young, and I don't really even pay attention on the message board. I would write these detailed write-ups, and then I would forget about them, and people would comment, "Oh, I always love her post," and I'm like, "Really?" So maybe it just kind of grew from there, and I would write more in details, and I wanted to expand that even further than just the message board. So.
Okay. And how many? You've been doing this almost 3 years. How many, off the top of your head, what do you think the number is? How many blogs have you done on your website? How many cases have you covered roughly, do you think, on there?
I'm not sure, but I do know that it's well over 20 articles are on there now.
Okay. And, of course, the two that you've been on before on Unfound that you've written about, one was Dale Kerstetter. That was the first one, which continues to be a very unique disappearance, and I know you continue to work on that one after the fact regarding platinum theft in the United States. And then, of course, last year in 2020, we had the disappearance of Christy Nichols. You were on that one, on Unfound for that one as well. Okay. So there's a little bit about Heather, about her blog, how often she writes, and I think what she's saying here is that if you have the motivation, you can get it done. Even if you have a daytime job and other responsibilities in your life, if it's a passion for you, you can do it just like she's been doing for almost 3 years. And the reason please.
I'm sorry. It's actually pretty simple because I designed the website myself. I just type them up in a Word document. I copy and paste and put pictures in. I mean, I've taught myself. It really isn't that complicated if someone wanted to start their own blog.
Right. But like you said, you got to have the passion for it, right? This isn't a money-making pursuit. This is something you have a passion for.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't make any money.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to be clear about that. This is something that you felt motivated to do. It's obviously very helpful. The listeners should know that you do, in many of the cases that you cover, you do get to talk to people in those families, correct?
Yes. And I try in almost every case. There are certain circumstances where I don't. Like if the person was found dead, sometimes the family just doesn't want to go there. But I do try to contact a lot of people, and some I just don't hear back. I don't even know if it's the right. Just kind of hit and miss with the contact information.
Does that, if you, maybe I should ask you this, when you do try to contact family members and they don't respond to you, does that affect whether you decide to cover that case or not?
It would in some cases, yes. It depends if I can find enough information online, and I don't just mean like recent articles. I mean like old newspaper articles. If I can find enough information, because with Nylene, there wasn't really any relatives to contact that I got through to, but there were several articles, so that's why I decided to go ahead.
There were.
Write it.
Sure, because I remember from Dale's, you've been in contact with his daughter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Daughter.
Yes, we're still in contact.
Yeah, and then with Christy, I think you were also in contact with somebody in her family, correct, as well? Sister, maybe? Or
several people. I've talked to her mother many times, her brother, her cousin.
Okay.
I've briefly spoke to her daughter after the article was already published.
Okay. So those two disappearances that you've appeared on Unfound for, both of those situations you've been in contact with family members. All right. So great. All right. So now everybody knows a little bit more about Heather Grotman, and I want you to go to her site, lostandfoundblogs.com. Correct? That is the website?
Yes.
Correct? Okay. Yes. So this brings us around, and you've already mentioned the disappearance we'll be talking about today, and that is the disappearance of 4-year-old Nyleen Marshall of Clancy, Montana. How did you first hear about her disappearance in 1983?
It was an Unsolved Mystery segment. It definitely stuck in my mind. I remember them interviewing her mother, Nancy, and she just seemed like such a sweet lady. And then, of course, the bizarre happenings later. It wasn't your typical missing persons case. So it really stuck in my mind.
It just stood out. And can you remember what year that was? I will admit that I watched Unsolved Mysteries back then with Robert Stack, but I can't remember. I don't remember seeing that one on the program. Do you remember what even that year could have been?
She went missing in, I believe, 83, and I believe it wasn't until 1991.
Okay.
that it was on Unsolved Mysteries.
All right. So 8 years later, and it just kind of stuck with you. For some reason, of course, we know there are missing children all over the United States, and I know that they've covered quite a few on Unsolved Mysteries back then, but that particular one just caught your attention.
Yeah.
Okay. And, all right, so you first heard about it in 1991, and then all these years later, last year, 2020, is when you finally wrote about it. In your process of deciding to write about any disappearance, including Nylene's, when do you end up feeling like, well, it's time? Like in Nylene's, it's almost 30 years you waited to write about it. How did you decide that, you know what, I think it's time to write about Nyleen? How did that come about?
Well, sometimes I'll just have a list and I'll Google her name and see what's out there, because I've said before, I can't add any more than Unsolved Mysteries, and I'm not going to bother writing.
Mm-hmm.
There would be no sense in that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there, like I said, there was a decent amount of information out there, and so I thought I could add a little bit more than the Unsolved Mystery segment and write a good article about it.
Mm-hmm. Regarding Nyleen and maybe and any of the other disappearances that you've written about on your blog, is there anything that you're particularly looking for when choosing to cover a particular case? Now, me, the way I do, of course, Unfound is we are kind of at the mercy of the guests. We cover the disappearances that when people want to talk to us. We can't make people be on the program. So when we can get people to talk to us, if guests say, yeah, I absolutely want to be on the program, those are the disappearances that we cover. We don't necessarily pick out particular ones to cover. We just find people who say, absolutely, I'd love to be on your program. Whereas with you, of course, you're contacting family members, but, maybe sometimes that's not possible. But just in general, are you looking for a particular type of disappearance or story when you're looking for your next disappearance to write about?
Definitely. I like ones that, have added twists and turns, because in addition to giving attention to the cases, I also enjoy the writing, and I like to challenge myself to write, well, okay, this happened that nobody expected. Mm-hmm. And I also like to convey emotion in my writing if it's warranted, of course. So it can make people really feel what those people were going through.
Right. Okay.
And this has some additional twists and
it does.
Terrible things happen.
Right, and we're of course going to talk about that. Okay. So at some point with Nyleen, you heard about her disappearance in 1991. You start your blog in 2018, and then at some point, maybe in late 2019 into early 2020, you decided, I think it's time to write about Nyleen's disappearance, and that's, how you started doing that. Are you a subscriber to any particular websites so you can get articles? For example, I'm a subscriber at newspapers.com. Do you use any subscription services to help you in your research in creating your blog?
Yeah, I currently don't have a subscription to that, but I usually do have a current subscription to newspapers.com, and that's the only one, because that usually gets me plenty of information.
Yeah.
And of course, just online, you'll see newspaper articles, and I even look at a message board once in a while just to see if a relative is posted and if they have something valuable to say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so we've covered your process, how you went about creating the blog, and how you decided to write about Nyleen's disappearance and why you decided to do that, and when you decided to do that. So let's just now get right into it. Some of the details, some of just the general details about her disappearance, and then we will eventually get to some of these things that happened after her disappearance, one in particular that's tragic as well. The facts in general: who are the Marshalls? How many children do they have? Where are they from? What have you learned about the Marshall family from back in 1983?
By all accounts, they were just a nice young Mormon couple. I will backtrack a little bit, and Nyleen was actually born Nyleen Kay Briscoe.
Okay.
So her birth father was named Bill Briscoe. Bill and Nancy divorced, And from everything I've learned, Bill was not a presence in Nylene's life at all. So Nancy married Kim Marshall, and he adopted Nyleen. So then she became Nyleen Kay Marshall.
Okay, so
Kim and
right, that's how she got her last name.
Were the couple. Okay. Yes. Okay. Kim and Nancy were the couple. They had 3 children. They had Nathan, Nyleen, and Noreen. And I believe when Nyleen went missing, Nathan was 6, and Noreen was maybe around 2, if I understand correctly.
Well, so Nyleen was the middle child, and I guess Nyleen, of course, was from the father. The mother and father got divorced. How about the youngest child? Was she a result of a union between the mother and the ex-husband or the current husband? Do you know?
From what I understand, I believe Kim would be Noreen's father.
Okay.
Father.
Okay. So Kim, who is a man, was the father of the youngest child.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Please continue.
And they were from, I believe, Alhambra, Montana. And really not much background, about them. They seem to have a big loving family. Of course, the Mormon family as well. And that day they just went to Kim was a member of the Capital City Radio Club, the Ham Operators Club, and the group just decided to have a picnic. And it was in the Elkhorn Mountains near the Helena National Forest. There's a few differing descriptions of the area. Unsolved Mystery said it was a secluded picnic area. Another place called it, a meadow or a clearing where the picnic took place.
Okay, so are you under the impression that are there like pavilions there? Like we know many places where these kind of events take place. There's like a pavilion. There's maybe a place, a rudimentary barbecue, set up that people can use if they bring their own charcoal and lighter fluid, etc. Was it like that, or do you think it was even more bare bones than that? Do you even know, was this an official park or what?
I've never been there, but I get the impression it's more rustic. Because they described it, that it was full of dense forest nestled between rocky cliffs and mine shafts. So maybe that's why they just found a clearing and decided to.
Okay.
And sadly, I don't have any idea how many people were at the picnic. See, a lot of this is just vague.
Right, and we're going to get into that. Yeah. We certainly are. We're going to make vague a topic later. So, and I think that could be a factor certainly in Nyleen's disappearance. Maybe, of course, not being solved here in 2021. But so this family decides to go to this get together, and it just happened to be like right near where they lived.
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
How convenient. Okay. Well, that's convenient. And do you even have any ideas if this is the first time that there was some kind of a get-together, or was this an annual thing, like some, hobbyists
I'm not sure. I didn't hear anything about it being a regular thing, but I'm not sure, once again.
Okay. All right, so
I don't believe the people at the picnic were necessarily a close-knit group of people. I know people kind of imply that, but I just think they were, several members that had the same interests, and they all brought their families, so they weren't necessarily,
They could have been around that area, but it could have been maybe everybody all over Montana who showed up.
Yes, and Nyleen was hanging out with children. I don't even know if Nyleen knew these children.
Probably not.
Congregate together.
Probably not. And I think that's an important point for everybody to remember regarding this disappearance, that she was not necessarily playing with children who were her friends, who, maybe from the neighborhood or anything. These would have been children she was meeting for the first time. So, okay, so we have this get-together. Adults getting together, they bring their children. It might have been just like a regional type of thing. I can't believe there couldn't be too many ham radio operators, enthusiasts just in that area to have a get-together. So I'm thinking it was probably a little bigger than that, a bigger area. All right, so they all get together. Every person, I think, in the United States has gone to some event like this. Everybody getting together and just hanging out. And let's move on to this. So the adults are doing their thing, and what have the articles said about what the kids were doing while the parents were socializing and drinking beers.
They said that, and I think it was just a few of them with Nyleen. I don't think it was a big group, and said that they were playing near Maupin Creek, and they were trying to chase frogs. But the unsolved mystery, I do give a little bit of weight to it because, I mean, the parents were involved. They actually show Nyleen sitting on a rock by herself, and they show, like, some young kids walking past her. So I don't even know that they were playing together. They were just near each other playing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you see pictures like that, you wonder if they're a little manipulative. You know, It just happens to be a picture of her sitting by herself. Well, that doesn't mean that she was by herself the whole time, but that is interesting. All right, so the children are there. They're doing their own thing. But here's where we get to that vagueness that both of us have already talked about. The details of this disappearance almost 40 years later are not clear. Can you maybe explain that, being that you've been digging up these articles, you've seen the unsolved mysteries? How would you explain that in your own words?
Well, the varying accounts, I mean, like one place even said that no foul play was suspected because it was a group of close-knit, family and friends, which isn't necessarily true. Mm-hmm. One account that I found compelling, and I put it in my article, said that there was a 13-year-old that was supposed to be watching Nyleen, and she had to go leave somewhere for a minute, told Nyleen to stay right there, and then when she got back, Nyleen was gone. Well, to me, this could explain why, if there was someone talking to Nyleen, why she was by herself temporarily. Mm-hmm. So I did decide to include that, but there are other articles around the time make no mention of the 13-year-old. But they do mention that, there were a few, and these children were very young. I mean, they range from like age 4 to 8. Yeah. Right. That were around Nyleen.
Right. What would you say, in your opinion, is the accepted version of that? Even though we have a couple stories where this preteen or 13-year-old is mentioned as being watching over Nyleen, and then other articles that don't mention this young person at all. What would you say in 2021 is the accepted version? If somebody were to go to NAMUS or the Charley Project, what is the accepted version, even though there seem to be contradictions?
Yeah, I mean, the accepted version would be that Nyleen wandered off. The question is, did someone help her to wander off, or did she just do it on her own?
Okay. All right, so she's playing with kids or something. She's not with the adults, obviously. Maybe some 12-year-old, 13-year-old was supposed to be watching her, but I guess the understanding is this 12 or 13-year-old would not have been a family member, correct?
Correct.
All right, so this could have been just some preteen that ended up being there that Nyleen had never met before. We just don't know. So she goes away, allegedly comes back, Nyleen's gone. How long did it take for people to realize that she was missing? Minutes, an hour, and what was done?
See, I have asked that, and I really don't know, but Unsolved Mysteries did say 4 p.m. was when she was thought to have went missing. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure when all of this started. I don't believe it was very long. I mean, I wouldn't say minutes, but of course, they're going to notice. I mean, someone's going to notice her not being there, but it's really hard to say exactly how long before they started a search. Okay.
All right, but searches, once they figured out maybe they were planning to go home and Nyleen wasn't around, but the searches were done. Did the people, of course the adults that were there, did they do searches? The other children, etc. I mean, do you have any idea, any articles or anything that you could find, even Unsolved Mysteries, they say anything about the kind of searches that were done right at that second?
I don't know exactly right then. I do believe Nancy, from what I understand, she was the first person to notice, and of course she was in a panic. Mm-hmm. The only thing they mentioned, I mean, the searches was, I'm sure they got people there quickly, And they said they did search for 10 days, and
Wow.
one place mentioned 2,800 volunteers.
Wow.
And and they had dogs, they had aerial, they had the infrared sensors using heat detection.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, the weather was beautiful that day, but from the accounts, it got bad. It got cold. It got rainy. And, in fact, they ended up calling the search off July 4th, and there was actually some snow in the mountains, from what I understand.
Wow, in July, there was snow in the mountains.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they talked about the rugged terrain, and the Lewis and Clark County coordinator was quoted in a newspaper article as saying, undergrowth in the area was so thick that searchers could have walked past the child and not seen her.
That was in an actual article.
Yes. And after 10 days, they called it off, and mainly they said after conferring with medical authorities throughout the nation, a decision was made to wind the search down. Heavy rains and low temperatures have made this youngster's survival virtually impossible.
Wow. And we have to remember, you said that July 4th they shut it down, but that would have been a full 10 days after she went missing, because she went missing on June 25th, correct?
Yeah, so that's why a big reason she wouldn't still be alive out there 10 days later with the temperatures that they had.
Right. So 2,800 people. That has to be one of the largest searches, I think, that we've covered on Unfound, except for maybe when we covered Flight 370 way back in July of 2017. But just for regular people, a single person, that has to be one of the largest searches I've ever heard of for Unfound. However, in the process of looking for Nylene and the police showing up, of course, the children who were also there were talked to, and they said that they had noticed somebody. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? Who did they notice? What did they say they saw?
They all do seem to agree that they saw a man in a purple jogging suit nearby. And some say that he tried to talk to them. I think one person got scared, and I think some of the kids just ignored them. But this one, I think he was 6, they did say that this man was talking to Nylene. And one child said they saw him kind of step closer, and she supposedly told this little boy, that man wants me to follow the shadow. And if you think about it, I'm sure that's a way for her to follow him into the woods.
Sure.
But I mean, these kids, just because they didn't know this man, I mean, they probably didn't stop and think, oh, is this a stranger? Does Nyleen know him?
Mm-hmm.
They're kids. They just knew, from what I tell, he was not with the picnic, and no one recognized him.
Because there was a sketch made of him, correct?
They said there was, but I've honestly never seen it, and I can imagine that it was probably released at one point.
Yeah, I would think so, too.
Because why would you have a composite if you're not going to release it?
Right, because I think I've read that they did do a sketch of this guy, and in a purple jogging suit, I think even in 1983 terms would stick out. I think all the other adults would remember that if he was part of their group.
And I don't know if any, there was really, and of course you don't know what the police are not releasing.
Sure.
I don't know if, I was told that Nathan may have even seen this person in the jogging suit.
So he would have been the older brother of Nylene.
Yes, I believe he was 6. Yeah.
Okay. Purple jogging suit. Once again, though, I think we have to say that is something, it's different than white T-shirt and blue jeans, which, that could be anybody, whereas a purple jogging suit, I think, would stick out anywhere. But this is what the children talked about when the police showed up, started questioning them, maybe the parents questioning them. Someone's talked about this guy with a purple jogging suit.
And I'm not sure why, but one of the articles said 5 days later, 2 children came forward, and these children did not know each other. They weren't conferring, and both mentioned the jogging suit. I'm not sure why it took 5 days unless the parents just didn't want to press the children for this upsetting thing that happened. But, I mean, it does seem a little bit compelling that there at least was somebody, because the kids are agreeing on the basics anyway. Maybe not what happened.
Yeah. But, and the listeners know that I don't have children, so I do not have as much experience with them as probably most of the listeners. But, you know, there's also the fact of, you know, are we sure, you know, that the children are telling the truth? You know, right? I mean, kids do make things up, and especially if they think that they will be rewarded for saying something, correct? You know, much more than adults. So, you know, there is that part of it that I think we have to keep in mind. But, and I think that this is why when we talked about earlier about what kind of area was this a regular park where there would be other people showing up to jog, to go fishing, you know, to just enjoy the outdoors, or was this something that really wasn't a park at all, right?
Yeah, it was the mountains. I don't think it was as friendly as the park. It was pretty treacherous. But if someone did, you know, if maybe somebody wanted to explore, I mean, I guess the jogging suit would make sense. Somebody just happened to be out there.
Okay. I think what we're saying here, you know, for the listeners, maybe to go in this a little deeper is, you know, you have your interests and hobbies. I have my interest in hobbies, and one of mine just happens to be disc golf. And I was just at a place today. It's a public park, so I'm there. Other players are there, but there are people walking their dogs. There's people jogging. There are people, you know, fishing, you know, etc. You know, people are there for different reasons. And I'm just wondering if this place where this get-together was held is also a place where other people show up for different reasons. You know, so maybe
I always got the impression that anybody was allowed to go there, and they didn't, you know, rent a specific area, from what I understand. They just found a nice spot, decided to stop there. All
right. So, and maybe it could be that this guy in the jogging suit was really there, but once again, to your knowledge, he was never located.
Correct, yes. And I didn't ever hear of anyone that they even, you know, thought was him, or maybe if they would have had and maybe they just didn't trust the composite sketch when it was children explaining what he looked like.
Right. To your knowledge, did any adults ever talk about seeing a guy in a purple jogging suit, or was it just children?
Yeah, there was no newspaper articles that mentioned man in the jogging suit, and in fact, a lot of the articles that happened soon after she went missing, they didn't even mention the man in the jogging suit at all.
Okay. All right.
I saw Mystery seemed to pick that up and talk about that more than anyone else, and that was 7, 8 years later.
Okay. All right, so we have this mysterious man in a purple jogging suit, but it seems like the children only saw him. It doesn't seem like the adults did, but maybe that might have been the guy's plan. We just don't know. All right, so there's that. So let's go back to the searches. Let's go over everything that was done in those next roughly 10 days. Again, dogs, helicopters, etc.
Yes, and I don't really think they found anything. I will say that when Nyleen went missing, she had shorts on and a yellow T-shirt, and she was barefoot. So I'm sure, and even one of the main searchers, Ken Gardner, there was a YouTube video where he said he still goes in there. He's still looking for that yellow. So it was surprising to me that they didn't find any trace, any. You think yellow would stand out.
You'd think.
She was, you know.
You'd think. Right. Did the police interview the people who were there? In particular, Nyleen's parents. Maybe just suspecting, hey, did one of the adults do something to Nyleen, one of the ham operator people, or the parents? How closely did the police look at the parents?
I know that they were interviewed. I don't know how intensively, and there was a mention that, you know, it said police did talk to everyone that was at the picnic. So they seemed to be pretty thorough in speaking with everyone, and there seemed to have been suspicion on Kim that was never from the police. It was from the general public, and I never understood that. He was at the picnic. He was never unaccounted for.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how he physically could have taken her.
Mm-hmm.
Or there would be no motive, of course.
Do you think this could have been, once again, you have a lot of experience reading about disappearances, could it be because it does seem to be that a lot of stepfathers are involved in their children's disappearances? Do you think that's a possibility, even going back to 1983?
Yeah, I think just the fact that he was her father was,
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think they looked twice at her, but you hear people, and it's never the police. The police had never said that he was a suspect.
Mm-hmm.
He was never detained, as far as I know, either. But of course, you're going to talk to them first.
Of course. And of course, just from a logistics and physical point of view, how was it, that somebody was able to sneak away from the adults there, convince Nylene to get in a car and take off, and people, never all put it together. That, at the same time, this adult who was at this, and Nylene went missing, right around the same time. So it doesn't seem they were able to put that all together, at least nothing that's ever been made public, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, so we have these searches that were done, 2,800 people, 10 days, dogs, helicopters. Nothing at all. We have this description of this man in a purple jogging suit. Something, at least publicly, it seems to go nowhere. I also see that they use a hypnotist. Who got hypnotized? Did it reveal anything?
There was just, I believe, one mention, and it said 9 months after she went missing, Dr. John Watkins had hypnotized, I believe, some of the children that were nearby to try to get more information about the man in the jogging suit, I believe. So there was a composite sketch, and this is very vague, but all it said was he resembled a man wanted for child molesting in another state. And I've never seen that composite sketch.
So what we're saying is the hypnotist didn't really make any headway. Hypnotizing people were there, maybe looking for this, trying to probe their memory of a guy in a jogging suit or anything like that. None of that worked.
Yes, and I think that just kind of goes to the parents' desperation. They were willing to try anything.
Yeah. I can understand that. A lot of my guests, although we don't talk about it on the program, use psychics. And everybody who's ever follows this program knows I don't take them seriously, but I know some of my listeners have used them, of course, to, no help at all. But so we get that, but I thought that we needed to talk about that because sometimes hypnotism does help, but we haven't talked about that in a while, I don't think, on the program. The feeling that you get looking back at articles at the time, the Unsolved Mysteries, all the work that you did putting your blog together, in your opinion, what do you think was the most popular theory at the time, that she walked off or that somebody abducted her? Because it has to be, I guess, either one or the other. What do you, of those two, what does it seem was the most popular theory at the time? Can you even get a feel for that?
I would think most people thought that she was abducted because of the man in the jogging suit sighting and just the fact that 10 days of intensive searching, they can't come up with anything. And they even said that search dogs got her scent in the mountains, and then it stopped abruptly. So that made people think, well, was she grabbed? That's why her scent stopped.
Okay. I think this is also one of those disappearances, and maybe we're doing this interview on March 9th, 2021, and this will be coming out on March 12th. Might be interesting if we could narrow down this particular area where this all happened. The actual, do you have an address or, a location on the road or near the road where this happened, where they would have parked their cars and everything else? Have you ever looked into that, Heather?
I'm not really sure. One reference made it sound like it was off of Warm Springs Creek Road. but that really doesn't mean anything to me. It's hard to even pinpoint exactly where the picnic area took place. They just say near Helena National Forest.
Right. Once again, we have more vagueness in this in the coverage of this disappearance of a little girl.
Yeah.
We have conflicting stories. They don't give an exact address. It is, I think the disappearances for children at least are covered a little differently these days, but it doesn't seem like it's very thorough reporting.
Yeah, and I think people were just having a nice picnic in the spring and summer, and they weren't paying attention to details, so they really can't recount anything. And of course, young children aren't going to be much help. They could tell fantastic stories and not do it to be mean, just they're just being kids. Yeah.
Okay. Now, after she went missing, there was, I have in my notes here, there was the film Adam, and that I think Nyleen got some attention there, and then her face ended up being on a milk carton also when that was popular back in the 1980s, 1990s. Both those things happened.
Yes, and it actually said her face was on grocery sacks and billboards. And at the end, I actually just recently watched the Adam movie, and it was very good. But the original airing, at the end of it, they showed 55 missing children, and Nyleen was one of them. And I assume they got tips, but they really didn't amount to anything, obviously.
Okay. All right, so she goes missing. It sounds they did more than enough to try to figure out if she walked off. How far could a 4-year-old in bare feet go by herself? Maybe if she was lured away, then maybe that would be quite a ways. So maybe, of course, if she was put in a car, but just on her own 2 feet and just wandering away. Maybe she thought she was playing hide and seek with somebody and just got lost somewhere. But there's it's a huge search area, but we don't know what direction she went. So all this is done. Nothing is found. Everybody, unfortunately, has to go on with their lives. So let's move on to some other things that ended up happening. We've already talked about the guy in the jogging suit. Maybe one thing that I should ask you is that, if these kids saw that, and once again, your impression. I realize that none of these articles are going to say this, but once again, your experience covering as many disappearances as you've had. Just a little theorizing here. If this is true that this jogging suit guy existed, why did the children not see Nyleen actually leave with him? Did they not think it was strange? What does your instincts tell you, Heather? If this jogging suit guy is real?
I just look at how young the children are, and in the reenactment anyway, they would just kind of show the children passing by Nyleen. So they could have just glanced and saw this man talking, didn't think anything about it, Now, an adult, of course, would feel differently had they seen the same situation.
Right. Right, and I guess we're then left with the idea that, once again, even though these kids were all playing together, then, I guess we are to understand that Nyleen might have been by herself.
Yes, I mean, at least they seemed like there were children around, just not, right beside her. And maybe that's why, if the jogging suit man exists, maybe that's why he spoke to Nyleen.
Okay.
To try to engage her a little bit if she was sitting by herself, and maybe it was just briefly.
Okay. All right. Because I guess maybe some of the listeners might be thinking, well, how could he have lured Nyleen away if she's playing with these other kids, and if she is getting, kind of, taken off in a direction, would these other kids not have seen that, and would they not have remembered that? Would they have not have told somebody, at least, at the time? Instead, all they can say is, well, there's this guy in a jogging suit. They don't say that this guy, we saw the guy in the purple jogging suit grab Nyleen's hand and walk her away.
No, and if this all is true, I don't think he had to grab her hand. And one little boy said he heard the man say, hey, do you like to play games? How about follow the shadows? So, to a 4-year-old, all they want to do is have fun and play.
Yeah.
And that seemed like fun,
Okay. And I guess none of the other, if he heard that, I guess this little boy, did not want to play that game. It was just meant for Nyleen.
No, and they made it sound like he just overheard it as he was walking by.
Okay. All right. So all of this goes on in 1983. Unfortunately, the Marshalls have to, move on with their lives. I mean, still trying to do everything that they can do, the searches and everything, but what is there to do? Then all of a sudden, these calls and letters start happening. When did they start happening? What do they say, etc.? Let's talk about that now.
I believe November of 85, so it was a little over 2 years later, a man called NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The police haven't really released a lot of details about what he said. And I believe 2 months later, he sent a letter to Child Find, the missing children's organization. And in the next 6 months, I believe he sent Child Find 2 more letters, and there were a couple of phone calls. And they did make a reference, and this was on Unsolved Mysteries even, but in later episodes, it was edited out. They said one clue, the man did say that his parents and 9-year-old sister were all killed in a car accident. So they didn't know if that could be a possible clue. But they were able to trace the last couple phone calls anyway to a phone booth near Madison, Wisconsin. But it seemed like after they traced the calls, then they stopped.
Okay.
And I was also told that Nyleen's parents received letters mailed to their house. And they also had an answering machine message left, and I don't know how long this was after Nyleen went missing, but it was something to the effect of, it was a small child saying, I guess my mommy and daddy are dead.
Wow.
And I know that may not sound legitimate, but the parents really did think it sounded like Nyleen.
Let me ask you a little bit about the letters that the parents received. Like you said, the phone calls got traced to Wisconsin, and we have to remember this disappearance took place in Montana. That is the upper Midwest of the United States, but Wisconsin and Montana are separated by Minnesota and the Dakotas, so they're really not even that close to each other, first of all. Regarding the letters, were they postmarked from a certain post office, a certain town? Do you know?
I'm not sure. From my understanding, it was Wisconsin, but I'm not positive on that. I don't know what the letters to the parents said, and I think it's frustrating that they still haven't released the entire letters. I mean, this many years later, what do they have to lose?
Right. Well, and I know that. Please.
Oh, John, I can read the excerpts that they released, and this is disjointed because it's just parts of each one.
That's fine, and we want to. There's an X-rated part in one of them that I do not want to cover on the. It's not relevant to anything, and actually it might make us think that it's just a complete put on anyway. But I know that you have published what you do know about those letters. Why don't you read the contents that you have right now, Heather?
Okay. It says, I didn't want their person to try to get information from her. All I could tell them was that she was okay. I hope Child Find can get the following back to her family. I picked Kay up on the road in the Elkhorn Park area between Helena and Boulder. She was crying and frightened, and as I held her, she was shaking, and I decided that I would keep her and love her. I took her home with me. I have a nice investment income, and I can work at home, so I care for her myself all the time. I teach her at home, and she likes to go with me when I travel. Her hair is short and curly now. She has really grown. She is about 45 inches and around 50 pounds. She has all 4 of her permanent upper and 2 of her lower incisors at this time. She takes a bath and brushes her teeth every day. She eats well. Her favorite meal is pizza and cherry. She would gladly recount to you trips to San Francisco, New York, Oklahoma City, New Orleans, Nashville, Chicago, Puerto Rico, and Canada. We were even in Britain for a month last year, and she loved it. Nobody questions passports. She is a sweet little girl, and it is because of how much I have grown to love her that I realize how much her family must miss her. But she is adjusted and seems happy. She trusts me and isn't afraid. We play a lot, and she laughs when we clown around. She smiles and acts coy when I tease her. She giggles when we snuggle and hugs me sometimes for no apparent reason. I love her, and I have her. I just can't let her go.
And as, once again, we don't know the veracity of these letters or not, but it all sounds nice and so PG rated. But within all of that, there is a section that's X rated, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
And he even implies that it's inappropriate in his wording, I believe.
Okay. And I'm not just really. If people want to read the full thing, they can go to your blog. You have the full publication there, right?
Yeah, Yes, I did really think about that, but I just wanted to kind of put it out there. And I did issue a warning before it in case people just wanted to skip over it.
I saw that, and I appreciate you doing that because it's very startling. You're reading it, it's all this good stuff, and then you read this one sentence, like, what? And then it goes back to being PG rated again.
And I remember the Unsolved Mystery segment. They didn't show it, so we're like, as hardcore fans are like, taping it and pausing it and reading it, and they were like, sorry that we did,
Yeah. So if they want to read that section, if people feel motivated to read that, they just have to go to Lost and Found Blogs, your coverage of Nylene's disappearance, and they can read that section along with everything that you just read there. So what's interesting to me about that is that it sounds to me the way this person, and if you read the X-rated part, you'll find out that person writing this is supposed to be a guy, that he makes it sound like she was like walking along the road all by herself. Right? I discovered her between. Isn't that not what what he said?
He's got it wrapped up in a nice little package, and he was just a good Samaritan that picked her up and decided to raise her.
But in that first part, I ran across her between. It makes it sound like he's in his car and she's just standing there on the side of the road.
Yeah, and from what I understand, it would be quite a journey to get to the road. And we're talking a 4-year-old that was tiny for her age that was barefoot.
Okay. So we have this letter, and we have this phone calls. Do you know if they believe that the person who sent this letter is the same person who was making these phone calls? Any proof of that one way or the other?
I do believe the same. They do believe the same person that made the phone calls wrote the letters. Yeah.
Okay.
And they claim that there was information contained in the letters that only an abductor would know. But of course, they've never told us and have never released that, so we can't really weigh in on our opinion.
Okay. Are you then saying that that what you read there is not the full entire letters? Yes,
exactly. They have not released, and even the family members, they've never seen the entirety of the letters.
But weren't the letters sent to the family?
Yeah, those two, but the ones that were sent to police and the Child Find and NCMEC, they've just released portions.
All right, so the family got some, law enforcement got some, these other organizations got letters as well. Were they all the same or all the same, or all different?
I don't know. I'm assuming they were all similar, but I would assume the ones to the parents were probably a little bit different, saying, trying to reassure them if it's anything like what they released.
Okay.
Trying to make them feel better.
All right. And these phone calls, when this person would call from these payphones, do we have any, does the public, all these years later, have any idea what this person said?
No. I don't believe that police have released anything. I mean, they just said, well, he knew some things that, he shouldn't have known if he wasn't.
Okay.
But like I said, this many years later, what's it going to hurt to release all of that?
I agree with you. That's usually not a very. It makes sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to people in law enforcement, not just in Montana, but anywhere else. But I guess what we're saying here is that whether we believe all of this stuff is true or not, this was perpetrated by one person. The letters and the calls. Okay.
Yes.
And no explanation why this person was in Montana and could have encountered her, then is calling from Wisconsin. But you also said these letters, at least the ones to the family, allegedly were postmarked from Wisconsin.
Yes, and that helped give the family hope, good or bad, because there were sightings of Nyleen all over the country.
Of course.
And, of course, this guy saying he traveled. Oh, okay, well, even the mother says on the segment, well, that makes sense. Because the sightings were all over.
Interesting. And the way my mind thinks, once again, this is the 80s, it's not the 2000s, but you still would have needed a passport to go to some of these places that he talked about. And you start wondering, because our passports, people may not realize this, you don't own your passport. The federal government owns your passport. And so when you go out of the country, it's tracked. They can see who's going out of the country and coming back in. And you just wonder if they could narrow it down. Was there some guy from Wisconsin that went to those places, went to England, went to Puerto Rico? Maybe you don't need a passport, but traveling like that in that time frame, that you could narrow that down. There might even be records of this all these years later.
And another thing, he says he calls her Kay, which is her middle name. If he picked up some random little girl, how did he know that was her middle name? I don't know that she could have told him. Maybe she could have, but...
Yeah, well, maybe it was in the articles. If they were making it up, making it up, just don't know.
I wonder how long he's been calling her Kay.
Right, that's right. So, but we want to remind everybody, we're not saying this is legitimate. I guess what we're trying to do is we're just doing some theorizing, and I think the listeners know, even when Anthony is on here from Crime Blogger 1983, that we do a little more theorizing and conjecturing than what I would ever do with a family member because of the circumstances and the person who I'm interviewing. So we're not saying that the letters and the calls are real. We're not saying they're not real. I think there's reasons to believe either.
And I don't really think we'd even be talking about her case right now if it weren't for those letters, because that really made her case stand out. Otherwise, it would be a little girl that probably got lost in the mountains. Wouldn't be as publicized, is what I'm saying.
You think, is that right? That's interesting. Let's talk about that a little bit. That's your impression.
I think those letters turned this case completely on its ear, whether it was good or bad.
Interesting. I wasn't even thinking about that.
It gave people hope.
Yeah.
Maybe she's alive and maybe she's being cared for. Maybe she's not, in the mountains and passed away.
Well, these things happen. We've covered a lot of disappearances where people infuse themselves into disappearances, saying they saw the missing man or woman somewhere, and then of course it turns out to not be true, and people all have all sorts of weird motivations for doing this.
And as soon as they pinpoint where these calls are coming from, they stop and they never continue.
And once again, being that we've been talking about this for a little while now, a few minutes, what was the time frame for these calls and these letters, Heather?
It was about 2.5 years after she went missing, and I believe they continued around 8 months.
All right, so roughly, let's just say sometime around the start of 1986, but then they ceased by the end of 1986.
Yes, and this person was clearly following everything closely in the news for him to know that they had traced these calls to this particular payphone.
And then if we're to believe it, he got scared and stopped doing any of this.
Yeah, and I'm sure they probably had police regularly patrolling that phone booth after the fact.
I'm sure. Okay. All right, so we had this going on, went on for not quite a year, and this person has never been identified. Whether this person really did kidnap, abduct Nylene or not, never been identified. Okay. And then we also have to remember that putting this in the timeline, you think it's around 1991 that Unsolved Mysteries covered Nylene's disappearance, and in their coverage they did include these calls, letters, etc.
Yes, and they showed a few excerpts on the screen.
Okay. Let's move on to this. This is also something that you write about in your blog, and it regards Richard James Wilson from 1991. Why don't you talk a little bit about him and how he is related to Nylene's disappearance?
Well, he was a Helena resident with a history of mental illness, and he turned himself in August of 91, said that he had killed Nyleen Kay Marshall as well as another woman, but they were never able to verify his story, and they even took him to the picnic area, and there was a place where he claimed to have buried her remains, and they dug and, of course, found nothing. And because of his unstable mental history past, they think it was just a false confession.
All right.
And there was another lead, and this is, like, once again, very vague, and it said, there was a brief and cryptic mention in an interview with Kim and Nancy Marshall about a possible lead. They were told a picture of a girl closely resembling Nylene was found with other pictures in a place where a suspect had apparently been. The girl seemed to have been beaten. The NCMEC did not say it was for sure Nylene, but said of the thousands of children on their list, it looks more like their daughter than anyone else. That was the only mention of that tip anywhere, which I found kind of interesting.
Okay. But this guy that we just talked about, Richard James Wilson, your impression, was that Mark Carr, the guy that claimed that he killed John Benet Ramsey, something like that?
Yeah, I think it was definitely just confession, like they said, a past of mental illness, and maybe he wanted, some attention.
Yeah. So you're inclined to, you personally, you're not inclined to believe that it had anything to do with Nylene's disappearance?
No, not at all.
Okay. All right. So we have somebody that took credit for it. Once again, just like in the John Benet Ramsey case, which of course is still unsolved as to who murdered her. But something, one positive thing, it does seem, came from all of this attention that Nyleen got, is that you wrote about how 3 other girls were found because of the attention that Nylene's disappearance got. Can you explain how that happened?
Well, the Jefferson County Undersheriff, Tim Campbell, he stated in a newspaper article that every time Unsolved Mysteries re-aired the case, he got a few new tips. And he said that the tips have led to 3 other lost children from around the country being reunited. And they only go into detail about one, but that was someone that watched the Unsolved Mysteries segment and thought that there was someone in her class that was Nylene. And this was in British Columbia. And they said, I can't remember their name, their fake names, but this girl's father would act very suspicious. He would stand outside the school and peer in the windows. And after watching that segment, they thought, well, maybe this is Nylene. So they did do a background check, and they found out that there were fake names. And they found out that the girl was actually someone named Monica Bonilla, and her father was really her father, and he had abducted her from her mother 8 years earlier.
Wow.
So Unsolved Mysteries even shared the reunion, and the mother was so grateful and, sad that Nylene was still missing.
Wow. Okay. What are the odds of that happening? I mean, the odds, seem, the probability is very, very, very low. But that happened, and it was in a different country.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. And that was one of the cases that was solved that was detailed, but you are led to believe that there were 2 others similar like this that happened the same way.
Yeah, he was quoted as saying there were 3, and I would love to know the other 2.
I would too.
They just didn't go into detail.
Okay. Now, I mentioned very early in our discussion that the disappearance of Nyleen was not the only tragedy to strike the Marshall family. Years later, something happened to Nyleen's mother. Why don't we talk about that now?
Okay, the family had been living in Japan for, I believe, several years with Kim's work. Kim had been transferred to Mexico. So Nancy was over there. She was hoping to find a house to rent so the family could just move right in. And she was staying at the Radisson Paraiso Hotel in Mexico City. She'd had friends there, I believe the night before she had spent having a good time and everything. But the next morning, they couldn't contact her, and this was July 24th, 1995. And there was a horrific sight. She was found hanging from a shower rod. Her hands had been bound behind her back. She was battered. Nearly every bone in her face was broken. And I won't go into detail, but there was an indication there was possibly a sexual assault. And her wedding ring, her watch, and her expensive perfume were taken, but her wallet was left behind, I believe, and the items in the safe were left behind.
And she was murdered.
That's what you would think, but of course the Mexican police declared it a suicide, and Kim Marshall was livid. He hired a PI, and the authorities then changed the classification to under investigation. And Kim was extremely frustrated and said he was advised by the State Department to not push a murder investigation because they said it would prevent them from releasing Nancy's body for burial. And although he knew his wife was murdered, he didn't press. He refused to let her body rot in a Mexican morgue. So her body was released to the family, and then she was buried in Texas. And I will say, this is not 100% confirmed, but I was told that while she was in Mexico, I believe she went to, the Mormon, the church, the temple. Mm-hmm. And she did have a feeling at one point that she was being followed. I believe she mentioned that to a friend.
She told somebody that before she got murdered.
Yes, and I can't 100% confirm that, but that's what I was told, that there was at least one moment where she was a little rattled.
Okay. And this happened in July.
I believe the hotel was cleaned up and everything. I don't even think they did forensics or anything, and I assume that the cases went nowhere.
Okay. So an American murdered in Mexico, and the Mexican authorities didn't want to do anything about it. They said it was a suicide.
Yes.
Okay. And so to this day, her murder is unsolved.
Yes.
Okay. Right in a hotel in Mexico City, July of 1995. So over 12 years after her daughter went missing.
Yes, and Nancy was only 42 when she was killed.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to this. There was something that happened in New Orleans. You can give us the year and the specifics regarding a girl thought she was the daughter of Nylene. What was this? Maybe you should explain that.
This was another, I believe a nurse had watched the Unsolved Mystery segment, and then a 19-year-old came into a New Orleans hospital, and she was about to give birth, and they seemed kind of skittish when they were questioned by the hospital staff. Her and a guy that was with her, they left abruptly. And they said she called herself Helena and said she thought her mother may have been named Nylene, but remembered very little of her childhood. She said she grew up in another country but had no trace of an accent. So when the nurses had already watched this segment, it rang a bell to them, and they wondered if it could be Nylene. And the couple was tracked down, and they did agree to a DNA test. And I'm actually told that they had to track down Nylene's birth father to get DNA from him because Nancy had passed away, and I believe her sample was just too old, and it wasn't in good condition. So they tracked him down and got a DNA sample. And you never hear anything else about it, so I'm assuming, of course, that it was not
Didn't go anywhere.
anything connected to Nyleen.
Do you even know when that was, Heather?
It says 15 years after Nyleen's disappearance, so that would be the
1998, late
and
1998.
and then she was 4, so this was a 19-year-old woman, and that's how old Nyleen would have been.
Okay. All right, so it doesn't seem, at least the impression we have over 20 years later, is that didn't go anywhere. Let me ask you this, and we've talked a couple times before doing this interview. Did you say that after you wrote the blog regarding Nyleen's disappearance, that somebody contacted you? Did you say that?
Yes, actually, a couple of months after I posted my blog, I got an email through my blog, and someone inquiring, was kind of curious about Heather versus Crystal Dawn and everything, and they wanted to discuss that case. So I did talk to this person on the phone, and it is a relative of Nyleen, and this I have been able to verify that this is a relative, and they wanted to compliment the article, and they appreciated that I wasn't like hard on Kim Marshall, because so many people are, and I never thought he had anything to do with it, and they did express to me that they appreciated that. And so that was interesting, because I will say a lot of people post out there and they say they're relatives of Nyleen, and maybe they are, but some are like her birth father's family, or people that just really don't know a whole lot about the situation, just hearsay. So people might want to question all these posts of relatives that are posting and claim to know things, because I have it on better authority that a lot of the stuff they're saying is not correct.
Right. Okay. Before this relative who contacted you said that, in all of your research for what you wrote about Nyleen's disappearance, did you ever get the impression that her stepfather was a suspect at all?
I mean, it just kind of seemed implied in some of the articles, but there was never any basis for it. And like I said, the police never seemed to call him out or anything. And there was some posts on message boards where they just said horrible things about Kim, and I don't really understand where any of that's coming from, honestly. And I was certainly not going to do that in my article, because I don't know of any basis they would have.
Okay.
Which I don't believe Kim has really been out there and interviewed. There was a few quotes in an article about his wife's death, and he has some really nice things to say about Nyleen that I included in my blog. But you can understand if he doesn't want to, speak why.
But we should say for the record, is Kim Marshall, once again, that's her stepfather. Kim is a man's name. Is he still alive?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And have you ever made any attempt to try to contact him?
No, I mean, I tried it I didn't really, I looked him up and stuff, but sometimes I just get the feeling they're not going to want to talk to me just because of what they've been through. Okay. And I will say the relative that contacted me, they wanted, them kept anonymously, so I'm definitely happy to do that.
Okay. And I'm not going to ask you who it is. All right. So you did have a relative of some type contact you after you wrote about Nyleen's disappearance, and you've had a very positive communication with this person?
Yes, and I was able to, verify some things that are kind of muddied up. I was able to give some clarity to a few things.
Okay.
But still, there's really just no developments in the case, sadly. There's really nothing to report.
Okay. Let's move on to this, and I just have in our outline for this interview, I just have it called discussion time. This is something we don't normally do in regular interviews for the program, because it's usually family members. But I would like to get into, some of the theory and theorizing a little bit about a lot of these different topics that we've talked about simply from a standpoint of looking at missing persons cases, not just Nylene's, but a lot of others combined, to do this with you, since you are very experienced in writing about disappearances, and so this is the only time that I do this. We've talked in this interview from the beginning about the lack of clarity in this disappearance. Still not sure. The articles from that time in 1983 and onward really don't give a lot of details as to how many people were there, what exactly is the story about, is this preteen, was she responsible for Nylene or not? Different articles saying different things. Using your experience, and being that I know that you've looked over a lot of different news articles for all of the disappearances that you've covered, why does this type of stuff happen? And could it be in Nylene's? Could it be because children are the main witness, or do you not think that that has anything to do with it? What's your insight?
Well, in this case, it's definitely a factor that there's children, because you just have to weigh how much you can believe them. But sometimes the articles are vague. They might talk to one person of the 20 that were there, and we get one person's impression of what happened. Or they just kind of don't do the work and don't sit there and interview people. But it's amazing how sometimes these articles are, the same date roughly, but have completely different facts in them. And then those facts just disappear over time. You don't see those facts anymore.
Why do you think that is? You're not one of these people. You do something else, but you write your blog. Any insight regarding? I don't think we'd be surprised, just frankly, if it was a 25-year-old addict who went missing, and the details aren't very specific, because we know sometimes how the media and law enforcement treats those types of people. They don't take it seriously. But here's a 4-year-old. You would think if any type of disappearance is going to be very exact and everything, this would be it. This isn't what happened. Any insight into that?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but maybe there's a deadline. This is a breaking story. They want to hurry up and get that article out there, so maybe they're not verifying things like we should. Maybe there have other newspapers that are releasing, and there's like a little bit of a competition there as far as it's breaking news.
Do you think maybe something else? And I did look up Clancy, Montana on the map, and I think everybody knows Montana is not a very highly populated state. Its main cities like Helena or Missoula, Montana, are not large compared to cities in other. Those are two of the largest cities in Montana, but they're not large compared to cities in other states. Could it be because it's a very rural area? It's not, she did not disappear in downtown New York City. She disappeared, out in the country somewhere. Could that be a factor as well?
Yes, definitely, because it was such rugged terrain. It's almost like, and we don't know how long she was out there before they started looking for her. Even if it was 20 minutes, that's a long time.
Right, and I'm just thinking once again, this was before the internet age, and how is a small town newspaper somewhere supposed to cover this?
Yeah.
It can get probably a little difficult. They don't, of course, expect something like this to happen. That might be a factor in the vagueness and the lack of clarity in many of these articles as well, even though I'm guessing some major news outlets in Montana ended up picking it up, but I don't think they probably sent any reporters to Clancy, Montana to get on-the-ground stories. So there's that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to this regarding child disappearances and maybe just disappearances in general. Listeners know I've been talking a lot about searches and why they fail to start 2021. It's become a common topic that I've kind of embraced so far this year. How does the failure of the searches affect your thinking regarding Nylene's disappearance, and maybe just in general, when you hear about any type of person going missing and there's searches and nothing is found, what is your usual knee-jerk reaction in those types of situations, Heather?
That there was foul play because we didn't find Nyleen in the mountains, so that opens the door to, was she taken out of the mountains?
Okay. And is that what you usually think? Like, if you hear, the listeners know that this year covered the disappearance of Jason Landry from Luling, Texas, a guy that was driving home and kind of got off on the wrong road, had a wreck. Car was there. He's not been found yet, and that happened back in December. And there have been 2 very lengthy and large searches for him, and he's not been found. And so when you hear a story about that, do you think about Nyleen's? Do you throw them kind of all in the same category? Do you think, searches could be better? What is your attitude on that?
Well, in his case, I would wonder if maybe he hit his head, maybe he was disoriented and wandered off. But with Nyleen, of course, her age was a factor where you kind of think that she would be helpless pretty much in the situation she was in, regardless of whether there was another person involved.
Do you think in a search like that, once again, I don't have any children, but do you think would a 4-year-old eventually come out of a hiding place if he or she thought people were looking, or would they continue to treat it as a game? What do you think?
Yeah, they do say that, sometimes these children are worried that they're going to be in trouble. And, they say sometimes the children will hide. And then I also think about, there's a couple cases I've heard where they find someone that was missing in a crevice. I mean, in the mountains, there's just so many places.
Sure.
And of course, as we always hear, there are mine shafts. They were searching mine shafts for Nyleen. And you and I talked about that. It seems like every case out in the country, there's mine shafts involved.
Yeah, right.
But that's just an example of she could be anywhere.
Right. And what I told you, in fact, they've searched mine shafts or oil wells or something like that for Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman, in Oklahoma, disappearances over 20 years old.
They think Dale Kerstetter was put in a mine shaft.
Right. But we also have to remember, as I mentioned to you when we talked about this on our last conversation, is that as much as these oil wells and mine shafts are always checked, I can't think of one disappearance ever where anybody was ever found in a mine shaft or an oil well or an abandoned coal mine or anything else. But still, people still think that that's common. But I can't think of one. I'm not saying it's never happened. But being that I can't think of one off the top of my head, they must be pretty rare.
And when I talked to the state police, Max, in the Dale Kerstetter case, it was like, can we locate a place that had a picture of where all the mine shafts were? And he said back in the day, all you had to do was put a tree in that mine shaft, and that was considered closed enough. But it's hard to even track down to find out where the mine shafts were this many years later.
Yeah, there's no records or anything like that. Okay. Do you think that in the year 2021 that a search would even be worth it for that area?
Well, I would always think it would be worth it. I guess maybe I would think if she was there, it could be a bone or maybe even a tiny piece of a shirt. I know it's been decades. But I can't say that a search would be wasted. I mean, there's always hope.
Okay. So maybe that's something that is still then on a choice. I don't know if, how many people you'd be able to get together, in the year 2021, 2022 to do something like that. But, of course, Nyleen's brother and sister, they're now in their 40s. Maybe they might be able to arrange something like that if they were motivated. So, maybe it's time for another walk through those woods up in the Clancy, Montana area. Let's move on to this topic, and now we're going to look at it from the other standpoint. While we talked about searches, if she did walk off all on her own, let's talk a little bit about abductions. We, as I have in my notes, and you have the outline as well, I talk about target-rich environments, that predators will go to if they want to abduct somebody. And I have the example of Morgan Harrington, who was abducted by a guy who was on that campus cruising around for the express purpose of finding a woman alone and, picking her up and attacking her and possibly killing her. That's how Morgan Harrington went missing, and that's how she got murdered. And we think about that, but on the other hand, we have the Delphi murders. These two girls dropped off to hang out somewhere, and they end up murdered. How do you think about abductions, maybe of children, but also, men are rarely abducted, but women, how do you think about that particular topic?
Well, I guess it would depend the situation. Like the Delphi murders was completely shocking because, nobody would have known that they were going to be out there.
Yeah.
I just figured that was a crime of opportunity because one big man is going to be able to overpower two young girls. But through fear, if nothing else.
Right. I guess what I'm saying here is if we're to believe this was some type of abduction of Nylene, the way you've portrayed this area does not sound to me like a target-rich environment, for a predator.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Yeah, and I can't see any of it being planned, no.
Right.
No one knew the circumstances that were going to happen that day.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so it does then kind of, you get a feel like this could be like the Delphi murders, and I bring them up because it's much more recent. A lot of people are familiar with them. And it's also two young girls, although they were older than 4, that sometimes children can be put in environments where it's just maybe bad luck.
Yeah. And a 4-year-old wouldn't know immediately that she was in danger. She probably wouldn't know for a while.
Right.
Because if they make everything seem fun.
Yeah. And maybe that moves us on. So that moves us on to this. Is your impression the way, once again, in covering as many disappearances, watching unsolved mysteries, I know maybe reading a lot of the pages at the Charley Project, etc., do you think that if she was abducted and she is still alive, maybe by this, being raised by this letter writer or somebody else, what do you think the odds are that Nylene would grow up to be a grown woman now in her early 40s and realize maybe that she could be Nylene? What do you think the odds are of that happening?
I don't think the odds are likely of that. Now, I do know that some of Nylene's relatives are on Ancestry.com, so my hope would be that, and so many people are going on there and getting a DNA test, I would hope that she would do that and not even, realizing the sinister backstory, but wouldn't that be great? If there was they show you a list of your relatives.
Right. Yeah, they do.
And in the news just in the past week, Brad Bishop that killed his family, this woman wanted to know who her birth father was. Her birth father's Brad Bishop, she found out.
Yeah, I saw that.
Completely shocked. Yeah.
I saw that. I did see that maybe yesterday or today. I did see that. So, but you don't think just in general that it would occur to a grown woman that, she starts asking, well, where's my mother? And, and where are my grandparents? And you don't think at some point, somebody might start to get suspicious that, the story they were told about being raised maybe is not the truth.
Yeah, that definitely is possible. I guess I think about when you're 4. I don't have a lot of memories of any of them.
No, me neither.
So it depends if he has any memories of her family.
Right.
Because like Sharon Marshall, that case, she was told her mother died. I don't know that she had any memories herself ever.
Because I'm thinking maybe you saw this story too about this woman. She was a teenager, 14, 15 years old. I think she had a bad home life like in Virginia or Maryland. And she just decided to take off. And everybody thought she was dead. She went to New York City. She was of, I don't know, German, Italian, Irish or descent, she made herself out to be Hispanic. She changed her name, pretended to be Hispanic or Italian, something like that, and she ended up living in New York City, having a family, and it wasn't until her kids started to ask about, hey, why don't we have any grandparents and all of this, that she decided it was time to get contact with her family like 20 years later, 25 years later. And so that's like, maybe that's what I'm thinking about when I think about Nylene's, you know, she did grow up and, you know, she did have children and they start asking, you know, questions that, you know, maybe she might start getting a little more curious about, you know, that stuff that Dad told me maybe doesn't quite make sense. I'm just asking you, you know, how do you look at that?
It's definitely a possibility, and because you've seen that before, where something was just off, and they'll even go to like the Charley Project. Some of them actually go on there, and you've heard where people recognize themselves, and But you know, the DNA test these days, that's the quickest way to at least start to see if that's a possibility.
It sure is.
They could do a DNA test with their own father without him even knowing it, probably, and see if it's a match. Yeah. Because you just need like a hair sample. Okay.
All right, so we've talked about her walking off searches, et cetera. We've talked about abductions. There's one more topic that I think that we could talk about that is certainly relevant regarding Nylene's disappearance, you know, looking at those phone calls and letters, if we're not to take them seriously. And that is kooks. That's my word for it. That is not Heather's word for them, but my word name is kooks. Your insight. Do you think that these types of people are more common in child disappearances in contrast to adult disappearances? Are these people truly mental cases, or are they simply like online trolls? How do you look at that entire, you know, phenomenon within missing persons community?
I do think they're kooks, and I think they probably come out more often with children cases, and they probably want attention. Maybe they're pedophiles. Maybe they have fantasies about killing children. And this way they can put themselves in the middle of the story, you know. But even a lot of the trolls ended up having some kind of mental deficit, if you think about it. People that like to stir up problems and, you know, hurt people for no reason. Sadly, I do think most of them are kooks. I mean, even with these letters, I mean, it doesn't happen. Abducting a child doesn't happen that way. You don't have this wonderful, happy life. And, you know, I mean, what a ridiculous account he put on there of how happy and wonderful their life was. Even if he has her, you know it's not like that.
Right. Right. The letters do stretch, I think, my imagination as being, you know, factual. It's just a little too quaint, a little too, isn't this just, and everybody lived happily ever after, certainly, and that maybe even makes the person more kooky than your average kook. But you do think that they are more common in child disappearances. You know, any insight into why that might be?
Well, the only thing I can think of is if they're pedophiles and, you know, they have an obsession with children and have fantasized horrible things, and then maybe they want to, this is part of their fantasy, you know, they want to get credit for it.
Yeah. There was a disappearance that we covered, I think it was back in 2018 now. It was the disappearance of Bonnie and Jeremy Dagus. Bonnie was the mother of Jeremy. Jeremy was just 4 months old. She was very young. I forget her exact age, but maybe early 20s. And this just coincidentally happened in the Tampa area where I live. And her mother and family has had to live for a while with this guy who was a kook, who would keep contacting them, claiming that he was Jeremy Dagus. You know, over and over and over, even though there was no chance that this guy was that. And finally, they did something about it. I think finally he had done enough over the internet with, you know, just saying all sorts of crazy things. They were able to finally arrest him for doing this, even though he lived, I think, in Ohio. And this, you know, this disappearance happened almost 30 years ago here in Florida. So, it's something that comes to mind, somebody claiming to be, a missing person and isn't, and just will not let a family go. Just will not let up. Okay. All right. So thank you once again. I don't get to do that too often for an official episode of Unfound. Go through some of this theory and get somebody else's who does what I do, their opinions on some of these topics. So it's good to be able to do that with you, Heather. Thank you. I would never ask you to give away what you're going to be publishing next, but are you working on some things right now? When do you think your next blog will be out?
I can tell you the subject, I think.
All right, well, go ahead. It's your website, so you do what you want.
It's about Nicholas Barclay, and I don't know if you've heard of that story. But it's got to be one of the most bizarre missing children's cases you're ever going to hear about.
Okay.
There's actually a documentary made about it. So it's definitely something that I want to talk about and have other people, because I think it's kind of under the radar. Even though there's a documentary, it's just, when I heard about it, it's hard to believe. And it actually kind of goes to something you were recently talking about, but I won't divulge that.
Okay. Something I was recently talking about where?
Yeah, just a minute ago, something you said made, I thought,
okay.
That's the Nicholas Barclay case right
there. Okay. All right. Well, do you have any idea when that'll be coming out? Would you make a prediction on that?
No, possibly by the end of the month. I've just now started, taking notes and doing the research. Okay,
great. So hopefully within the next 20 days, once again, we're doing this interview on March 9th, 2021.
Yeah.
Once again, your website is the Lost and Found Blogs, LOSTNFOUNDBLOGS.com. And for the listeners, I think of course they should read everything that you've written on your blog, Heather. But these last two you've written regarding Judy Smith and David Glenn Lewis are certainly very well timed, considering what I've been talking about so far in 2021 about searches and people taking off and people walking away from their lives, because we've covered a few disappearances so far in 2021. Noah Davis, T.J. Murray. We just ran into a bunch that were very similar, even though they happened at all different times. And I've started going more toward the idea that these people just walked off. And so then you have these two, David Glenn Lewis and Judy Smith. They walked off too, but they were actually found. And that's the
they were found, but there's still just as many questions as there ever was.
Right, that's right. In finding them, it seems like the mystery only got deeper. And they were found deceased, but I don't. I don't want to give any of it away. I want people to go and read everything, and specifically those two. And maybe some people will start understanding why more and more. Maybe I start leaning more toward, I think this person walked off. I don't know what happened to that person, but I think that person walked off. And these two, David Glenn Lewis and Judy Smith, are perfect examples of that.
And there's a mental illness factor, I believe, in a lot of these cases that people don't want to address, and they don't want to believe, whether it's guilt, if it's a family member and they didn't see it, of course it's no one's fault. But I think people are just wanting to deny that maybe something was off in their head, by no fault of their own, of course.
Okay. All right. Any final words before we complete this interview? Let's maybe put this out there. If one of the listeners wanted to get in touch with you, make a recommendation to you about either a murder, a disappearance, or a person being found, a story like that, how would that person contact you?
I have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, but I also have an email address, and it's just lostandfoundblogs@yahoo.com.
All right, and
I actually get tips on the cases. People tell me who killed who. Some very interesting emails.
I bet. Yeah, I get them too. Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. I'm kind of like brace myself every time I got another email. Let's see what this one's about.
Yep, I'm the same way. I wouldn't say it happens
Yeah.
every day, but it happens. I got you on that for sure. Why don't you just say, spell that out for the listeners again, your website. What is it, please?
It's LOSTNFOUNDBLOGS. .com, yes. And it's the uniform on all of the social media pages as well. And lostandfoundblogs@yahoo is my email address.
Okay, great. And you have a Facebook page and on Instagram, etc.
Yes.
Okay, great. Heather, any final words before we complete this interview?
Now, I'm just very happy that you asked me. I always enjoy being on your program.
And I enjoy having you. It's been a great discussion. I hope the listeners enjoyed it as well. And I appreciate you once again for joining me on an episode of Unfound.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And that was my interview with Heather Grotman, creator and writer at the lostandfoundblogs.com. I thank Heather for joining me and all of you for the third time. She previously appeared to talk about the disappearances of Dale Kerstetter and Christy Nichols. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, please do so. As we talked about in the interview, one of the tough parts to understand about this disappearance is the actual circumstances are vague. And this seems to have been compounded by the lack of precise reporting at the time. For example, did the other children just allow Nylene to walk off with the guy in the jogging suit, if he even exists? Or was Nylene with the 12-year-old and the girl left Nylene alone for just a few minutes? Or was it some combo of both? Or neither? And really, why did a bunch of adults not remember a guy in a purple jogging suit? This is in contrast to the abduction and murder of Jacob Wetterling. From the moment he disappeared, the details were very specific and turned out to be very accurate. And the kidnapping was also observed by a child. Yes, the perpetrator wasn't caught until almost 30 years later, and yes, many other men were suspects during that time. But the whens and hows were never in dispute. Jacob was with a friend. A guy pulled up and took Jacob into his car. So, why the difference with Nylene's? Certainly, it could have something to do with the ages of the children who were witnesses. Were they much younger than Jacob's friend when he went missing? The younger the kids get, the less accurate their recollections might be. Also, and this is one of those paradoxes, sometimes it actually is better to have just a few witnesses than many. It's that whole Rashomon thing, if you've ever seen that movie. It's a well-known scientific fact that humans perceive the same incident differently, depending on your point of view, when they first saw what was happening, and how it affected them emotionally. This could have been happening at the time of Nylene's disappearance. Through all of that, though, we can't deny a couple of facts. First, 2,800 people with dogs and helicopters and infrared searched for a 4-year-old girl who wasn't wearing any shoes, and they found nothing. It sounds impossible, but Jason Landry is also still missing from an area that is easier to search. And the second fact is, and this goes back to Heather and my discussion about where predators stalk prey, a ham radio enthusiast get-together doesn't sound like a likely place where a child could be kidnapped. Really, what predator would even suspect that children would be there? So why would a predator show up? Unless he was there all the time. Or the guy in the jogging suit had heard about the get-together and knew children would be there and decided to take a chance. This would then make the predator someone from the immediate area, who kept tabs on happenings at that place where the get-together was held. That couldn't be a huge number of people, could it? Maybe it's time again for police to examine their sex offender list from the area. See if any of them ended up moving to Wisconsin, for example. Maybe then we would know if what came from the mouths of babes was true. I'll leave the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.